two really great talks if you were sitting through this entire track about open data and e-government and some real life things that people are doing with open data and e-government systems and how we helping citizens live a better life, making a difference to communities. And I'm kind of going to go on to the flip side, the B side of that, simply because that's kind of like the default position from where I come from. And we're talking about activism and the relationship between activism and open data. And while we've seen what people have really done, what I'm actually going to do is put down something that I think that we could do. So it is more of a thought experiment or a speculative view of what we need to do to make ordinary people take control and apply the right pressures to the right organizations and at the right levels. So that's where the activism part comes in. Now, the word activism, if I say someone's an activist, I don't know what images come to your mind. Maybe flower power, you know, hippies, Greenpeace, yeah, okay, yeah. And they're actually quite militant, right? But where I come from, which is South Africa, you know, when you say you're an activist, it is not this quiet, you know, single file walking down the street. It is really, really intense. You know, you kind of like chant, whoos, whoos, you know, and then someone will shout out at a different pitch, Papa, Papa, and then someone will go, Amandla, Amandla, which means power or strength, and then the rest of the people will chant back, where to, which is to the people. So that is my history, you know, and you get tsunami-class waves of people flowing through the city doing this, and it scares the heck out of everyone. So, you know, I started off growing up in South Africa pre-1992, before we became a democracy. You're actually an activist by default. You don't have a choice. That's just the way it was, you know. And the very first time I protested was at the age of 8. I was in grade 2, it was 1977. 1 year before that, children between the ages of 8 to 16 were protesting against having to be forced to learn in the medium of Afrikaans, not English, or not in their native first language. And in the year 1976, about 500 children were killed as a result of the protest. And sometime in 1977, in the school that I was, age 8, the highest grade we had in that school was grade 6, grade 8. So that's about 12, 13 years old. And one day after, you know, school assembly, a few of the older kids walked out onto the field, and I followed them. And it was, as social activists, it was the worst planned protest ever, because right across the road from our school was the police station. Okay, and so they just went, knocked on the door and says, please come get these kids back into the class. But the most frightening thing for me as a enthusiastic activist at that stage was the headmaster coming and says, Aslam, I'm going to tell your father, get back into the class. And so I went back into the class, and I didn't do anything for the next 10 years. So, you know, in those early years growing up, you go through just following the masses in that way. But along the way, you basically just learn how to follow the rules of society. Nothing else. And it's only when you get to those teenage years that you start actually questioning why certain things are like that. And the rules of society were completely extraordinary. You know, you kind of knew when you walked through town that across that road was white businesses, and we lived on this side, and you don't cross on that side, and you stayed on this side. And those restaurants and pubs were not for us, those were for us. So it was really, really odd for me to explain that to you, but it was so much part of our lives that you just like wove into your life, and you said, this is what you did, and this is what you didn't do. But in 1985, the state of emergency was declared. And by state of emergency, it meant certain things like you could not be seen outside after a certain curfew, right, of let's say 7 p.m. a gathering of more than a few people in a public space was constituted or construed as a protest, and you could have been arrested. So it's that kind of life, right? And it's at that stage that we started as students, as school kids, also protesting again, and a few of my friends were expelled and all sorts of things. But by the time you get to a year later, one of the aspects or powers given to the security forces with the state of emergency is that you could detain someone without trial. Basically incarcerate them, keep them in jail for as long as you want. And you don't have to ask any questions. And in 1986, when I was 17 years old, my older brother, who was 4 years older than me, was studying at, he was doing in his 4th year of medical studies, becoming a doctor. And the university that he went to was one of the most active student bodies in terms of protest. And he and many others were in a protest one day, and he was arrested, taken into detention. I remember coming home from school, and my parents were there completely shell-shocked. What are we going to do? We don't even know which jail or prison he's in. How do you reach him? And 6 weeks later, he gets released. 6 weeks in detention without trial. And what do you feel as a 17-year-old is just anger and hatred. That's all, nothing else. Complete anger and hatred. You know, and then you grow up and you start going to university, and then you start understanding a little bit more, and you start getting a bit more organized as someone who's involved in social protest. At about the same time, the trade unions got together and united under one federation known as the Confederation or Congress of South African Trade Unions, COSATU. And they were mostly motivated by socialist thinking, and the worker comes first. And they had the slogan called "The people shall govern," you know, and they used to have protest signs, something like that. And we as students had T-shirts called "The purple shall govern." And it's because when we were protesting, the security forces used to come up with a huge tanker. And in this water tanker was not water, but purple paint. And there was a guy that sat there, and he just sprayed us. And if you ended up with purple paint, you were the enemy, and you got picked up, and you got jailed, etc. So insane things like that. And 1993, fast forward, we actually were on the brink of a civil war. The person you see here, his name is Chris Hani. His assassination almost led to a civil war. At that time, he was considered most probably the second most popular leader, black leader, after Nelson Mandela in the country. His assassination was untimely. We're in the middle of negotiations of how to transition to a better government. And the irony is that his assassination accelerated the effort towards a democratic first election in 1994. So if you lived in that period, as I have, you don't have a choice. You have to be part of the system of this. And so around, I look at my life in two phases now, you know, pre-1992 and post-1992. And I now see it as a privilege when I speak to people that I actually lived through both periods. And in a couple of years' time, if I'm still alive, I will be in a position where I would have lived under democracy for longer than when I've lived under oppression. And that's a significant thing for me. So I hope to live to that time. But the question in terms of the theme of this track is that, would data have made a difference to us in those distinct periods? Would data have made a difference to what we were doing? You know, and as a geek and as a software developer, like many of you, I want to believe it is. I really do. You know, so that is my natural instinct to say, yeah, of course, you know, data is everything. But I'm not sure about that, and so I'm going to test that uncertainty of mine by sharing with you a little bit more. So this is the second most beautiful, you know, city being represented at this conference. This is Cape Town. Okay, that's a Google image, a Google Earth image on that side, and this is slightly offshore, just taking a photograph of it. We have this crazy mountain in the middle called Table Mountain. It's now been voted as a natural wonder of the world, but it messes up everything from transport and even cell phone towers and coverage and things like that. But most of you would see this bottom photograph, but I'm interested in that top corner up there, which is a place called Khayelitsha, which is a suburb in Cape Town. It's an interesting suburb. It actually means, in the dominant language of the people who originally lived there, the Xhosa people, the name Khayelitsha means new home. And so this is the extent of which it actually occupies of Cape Town, right? And the coastline along that part is actually quite dramatic. It's a dramatically beautiful coastline. White sandy beaches, a few places with a scraggy, rocky coastline that just dips away. But if we go in a little bit closer, right, every little square or rectangle that you see there is actually a house. It really is, right? And you'll see that some roads are just informally just made by people walking. But if you go down to street level, this is what you see. These are the houses that you see. Now, yes, there are very, very poor people living here, but there are families living here. There's people where two parents are working at a very low-paying job, right, with most probably 2 or 3 kids, maybe 4 kids, that are going to school, and they live here. And they will build their house out of anything that they find. And this is a dramatic two sides to South African life, that you have people erecting up their own houses, and yet we have an obligation from a city or government perspective to provide them with electricity. So you have this cobweb of electricity just going out to little shacks. And if you put up your house, over in a couple of hours and you don't have electricity, you help yourself. It's dangerous, but you do. And look at that. It's something about a testament to human tenacity that someone will still find a satellite dish and put it up on their shack. But another part of Khayelitsha is that there's almost no bulk sewage. So what we have there, those blue little things, are portable toilets that you might find at a rock concert or something like that. And a company won the contract to actually install this throughout Khayelitsha. And it's dotted all over the place. And they have a service level agreement to come and clean it. But they don't. Okay? They absolutely don't. And so we have these chemical toilets being shared by a multitude of these shacks, these houses, because there isn't sufficient bulk sewage installed in the suburb. And so people protested this year. I'm talking about this year. June this year, people started protesting using the most shocking means possible. That is, they took the contents of these portable toilets, bagged them, and started putting them at city offices. So you'll see up here, Cape Town. It became known as the Poo Wars. Cape Town Poo Wars, 180 people arrested. If you look right at the bottom, a group actually managed to get it to Cape Town International Airport and make a deposit as well, right? But it was quite frenetic. There's people here, ordinary people living in this substandard conditions, that stood up and actually started telling everyone, hey, this is not on, we want better service. Okay. But what happened was that those 2 news articles there, those 2 links, the first one is DA's, Democratic Alliance. It's the official opposition to the present party that's holding government. And on that side is the ANC. And so it degraded into a battle for political points, because next year's the next election. So why did nearly 4 million residents of Cape Town not know about this issue sooner? It's not that the toilets were installed a week before that. They've been installed there for a long, long time. How widespread is it? Is it only for Khayelitsha? Or are there other parts of Cape Town that are also affected? Most importantly for me as a citizen of Cape Town is that why did we let this become a political battle as opposed to a people battle? And so my perception is that because it was 180, 200 people that were just making noise again, going who's, right? That kind of stuff. And the media feeds into that, and the media is also responsible for creating this perception that it is a political battle. But let's look at some of the data behind that. And I did some trawling to try to find some of this data. So Khayelitsha itself is about 29 square kilometers in extent. There's about 400,000 people living in Khayelitsha. Right? And that's just a fact. Okay? And that reaches to your mind. And in your mind, you're sitting and you're thinking about, what does this fact mean, 400,000 people? Okay? 400,000 people means there's about 13,700 people per square kilometer. Put it to you in a different way. So if I stood here like this, my wingspan is more than a meter, but a square meter on average is 14 people standing here. The square meter on average. That's a density of living in Khayelitsha. Okay? There's about 2,000 people that share about, on average, 11 flush toilets. 2,000 people. Right? So we're taking some facts and we're distilling it down. And to give you some idea, if everyone in Denmark had to live in that same density, at that same density, Denmark only needs to be about 400 square kilometers. Right? So that's the density that we're talking about. So what I'm actually doing with you is that I'm actually taking some raw data and I'm distilling it down into some facts that reaches not just your mind, but your heart as well. Okay? And that is what we need to do with data. It touches the mind, but we need to also touch the heart. And so another way I can say that is that, 180 people per flush toilet, or on average, people in Khayelitsha need to queue up every 8 minutes to use the toilet once in a day if they want to use a flush toilet. That's what it means. But to make this appeal even more to your heart and not your mind, 25 kilometers away, bird's eye, 25 kilometers away, there's another suburb called Durbanville, roughly the same size and extent, which is about 27 square kilometers. It has 55,000 people living there, right? That's about 2,000 people per square kilometer. And there's, I said one flush toilet, but it's a middle-class income suburb, and there's most probably 2 bathrooms in that house. And on average, 4 people use 2 bathrooms. 25 kilometers apart, and we have such a contrast. Now, from an activism point of view, what we want to do is bring awareness to this imbalance. It's not that we actually know how to solve it. Solving it is a different problem, because to achieve the same ratio of people to flush toilets in Khayelitsha, I'd have to build 100,000 toilets in Khayelitsha. I don't think we could even do that right now. So we have to come up with other solutions. But as an activist, you want to bring attention to this problem, and you want to appeal to the minds of people. So where did I find this data? The data's out there. It's not all open data. So I trawled Statistics South Africa. I did a contract with them. I also knew some people at Statistics South Africa who gave me some census data, so I could get, most latest population stuff. There's a report of the Khayelitsha Mshengu Toilet Social Audit, which was an NGO that went around and did an audit of this. Mshengu is the name of the company that was awarded that contract. There's a website, Open Data for Africa, which has some information as well. Wikipedia has some, but we know what Wikipedia is like, and various qualitative information from various websites. And I went through the various websites, and it was actually the effort of correlating what data is most probably correct by looking at it from different angles, so you zone in and triangulate to get some accurate data. So what would we do differently if we had access to data? What? If everyone had access to this data, what would we do differently? The thing is that, if you just offer data to social activists, they have no idea what to do with it. They can't do anything with that data. It's of very little value until it is geeks like us that have the ability to write software, to manipulate data, to distill it into knowledge, into fact. And the way we present that and offer that to our colleagues on the social side who are standing on the street and protesting, That is the way we actually reach out and make people aware of the efforts and campaigns of certain things. So it is about distillation into facts that appeal to hearts and minds, and in that order, hearts and minds. A classic example of this is actually Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth. They took a large volume of data, crunched it down. Whether you agree with his views or not, it doesn't matter. And it wasn't about the documentary, it was the dramatic visualizations that he actually put up that stick with people. There were one or two facts out of an hour-long or hour-and-a-half-long documentary that stick with people. So that's what sticks. So it's the stickability of this data that we're after as social activists. And so we have this concept of open data, and digital activists need to discover things in this data. That's what we're after, right? And when we discover that, we want to share that. And when we share it, it becomes common knowledge. It's easily digestible. Anyone could read this, understand what it means. It evokes a feeling in you. And social activists need to share. They need to take this common knowledge or knowledge and make it common by sharing it and distributing it to the right people and bringing an awareness to us, right? So open data for digital activists is the freedom to discover something in data, and social activists is about the freedom to distribute. So there's many aspects which I think are necessary for this freedom to discover, but I'm going to pick up on three things. And the first one is frictionless sharing of data sets. The second one is how do we actually combine data? And the third one is that why do I even have to find out which server it's on? I should just find it, right? But as a prerequisite, and this comes from the Free Software Foundation efforts, and from which open data was spawned out of, I like to refer to it as software freedoms as opposed to free software. Free software confuses people as it is free, you don't have to pay anything for it. But these appeal to our human rights. So software freedoms is about the freedom to execute and modify software, freedom to distribute it, freedom to share changes. And on the open data side, data freedoms is freedom to access, reuse, redistribute, available as a whole, and it's machine readable. Now, these are normally codified in licenses like GPL and others. Right? So it's normally codified in that. That's what those licenses give you. It gives you a way to actually describe that these freedoms are being honored. But let's just look at this frictionless sharing of data. With open data, it's an attention. On one side, you wish you had some kind of standardized format, and the promise is that if you have the standard format, then everything will be easily shareable, right? And at the other side, there's let's just produce data in the lowest common denominator, and if it's in the lowest common denominator, it's equally shareable, right? But the problem is that when we start creating standards, especially around data, we have a tendency to go overboard and start adorning it to make it as rich as possible, right? So we end up with this huge monstrosity of standards, which actually become really difficult to comply to. And the problem with the lowest common denominator is that, whoops, hold on. Is that they're completely anemic. By anemic, I mean there's no richness to the data. There's not much more you can pick out apart from a value and perhaps a name of what the data represents. But the constraint is actually metadata, the things about the data that's important. That's what the constraint is. With standards-based, you're going to have to provide that metadata pretty early, right? So there's a cost attached to providing metadata. With anemic, lowest common denominator, you never know when you're going to get that metadata and if you'll get it at all. And so we have this challenge around metadata. And I believe it's a challenge that's not going to go away. But to give you an idea about what we mean by metadata, any concept can be described in two parts, which is its meaning, its definition within a context, and the variables which we can use to measure this concept. And that's the domain, type, range of values. And sometimes we classify that these ranges mean these things. These values for color represent green, etc. But it's really important that we get this right. And so why is this important? So I'll give you an example. How do you compare poverty between two countries? It turns out, and it's from my time that I spent with Statistics South Africa, that poverty is a very controversial problem to define. It's a really controversial thing, right? So if we had to try to do that, there's a whole bunch of different organizations that have defined poverty in different ways. And this is just the poverty threshold. The US Census Bureau, the World Bank, UNESCO, World Health Organization, all have different definitions and methodologies, and mountains of research have gone into defining a poverty threshold. The US Census Bureau has about 48 poverty thresholds. South Africa has 2, when I think maybe we need a little bit more. But South Africa based their work on the World Bank, and it was an adjustment for sub-Saharan economies. And one of the adjustments was that what's the cost of firewood for heat, right? Whereas everyone else is what's the cost of electricity. We're talking about firewood. So this is the kind of adjustment that you have. So we can't talk about poverty unless we talk about the metadata. And it means that we can't actually compare poverty between countries unless we have the metadata. Even with the metadata, it becomes difficult, but we have a better chance. No metadata, no analysis. It's simple as that. The error margins are far too high. Our interpretation of that is far too loose. So the problem with the strict data format is that it creates a high barrier to entry. To become participatory in sharing your data sets, when you have a standard, it means that we have to put effort to comply to that. And that compliance is actually a choice. I can choose whether I want to comply to the standard or not. It doesn't make a difference whether I don't. But the cost of metadata doesn't go away. At some point, I have to provide this data, whether it's late or early, upfront or in flight. It doesn't matter. So there's a notion here that perhaps we just need the simplest extensible format for metadata and the lowest common denominator for the actual data. And I was pleased to find the Open Knowledge Foundation has a data package standard that they're promoting, which I think is a step in the right direction. By their own choice, it's JSON, which is reasonably extendable. They don't impose any particular structure to that. But you use JSON for metadata and CSV for data, and you take the two and you bundle it up, and that becomes a data package that you can share with people, between people. So that's a step in the right direction. Whether it's JSON or YAML or XML, it doesn't matter. But it's that separation of let's focus the standards that's extensible on metadata and use the lowest common denominator for the data itself. The next one is to how do you mix in, how do you compose, how do you actually do that, how do you actually work with the data? How do we want to work with the data as a digital activist? And so when you do lower the barrier for sharing data sets, you lower the barrier for getting in, and that is what we're talking about by frictionless data sets, then the constraint shifts to how do you get facts out? How do you get knowledge out? I throw data in, how do I get knowledge out? So the constraint shifts to that. And it's not an easy problem to solve, not at all. And we're talking here about many things. It's about our mental effort as well as the cost of computation of working with data sets. Please don't confuse this cost of computation with big data. I don't think we're yet in the land of big data when it comes to open data. There's lots and lots and lots of little data sets out there that we could actually do quite well with a spreadsheet, or some reasonable tooling. But this is not a big data problem yet. It'll become a big data problem when we eventually get access to our private data. That becomes a big data problem. Until then, we'll fight that battle. So why is composition of data really valuable for us? Because let's take an example. When is per capita income interesting? It's when I start correlating it with other things. So I might want to look at what is the correlation between infant mortality and per capita income. Or I might be interested in what is the correlation between per capita income with parent-to-child HIV infections, if I'm interested in health systems within an African context or developing country context. So it implies that the really interesting things about data, the facts that we really want to surface, like I did with the toilet issues at Khayelitsha, lurks in the intersection of data, not in a single data set. It also implies that we actually want to get raw, unsanitized data that we want to actually be able to sanitize, not post-processed data that statistical organizations provide. We want to have the option to actually deal with the raw data as well. And so here's an idea that I have, and I tested this to some extent, that what if you took every data set and just split it into every single column that's possible and treat each column as a single data set? So basically smash it into pieces, right? And thereafter, to find data based on values. Remove duplication and say that, hey, here's this name, Aslam, and what other data, which other columns does Aslam appear in? And when I start doing that, then I start seeing the relationship between things that were previously I thought were disconnected. Now, how do we actually do that? I don't know. I really don't know. But there's some things that I have tried. I've tried the first option, which is set-based, and that is working with a few million rows of data, splitting it up, throwing it into something like Redis, and using Redis to do set intersections of data to find what are the intersections and what are the things that are lurking in between. And that's reasonable. It could be graph-based, because graph works with values, not names of columns and things. Or it could be something else. But it doesn't matter what we eventually come up with. I think there's opportunity here for us to solve certain things. And it might not be one size fits all, one strategy for everything. It might be peculiar to the way your data is distributed, or the nature of the data that you want to work through. That'll force you to choose a particular strategy. So it's only when we are able to do that that we can look for trends, and that is a mental effort. That's the cost of thinking about what do we see in this data, is we're putting down hypotheses and proving or disproving that. So there's a tool that actually does this. It's called ClickView by ClickTech. Problem is that it fails the prerequisites. It's proprietary, and over and above that is expensive, and I don't think anyone's actually prepared to go and get licensing. But I use it because there's a free single-user version of it out there, and that's what I use. Okay. But what we're really after is software that satisfies those prerequisites as well, because it appeals to our freedom from a human rights perspective as well. And the last bit is that digital activists need is location independence, and that is that let's stop looking around, stop sharing URLs to find the data. We should be able to gather the data that we need in a better, more intelligent way. And I was pleased, this is a quote by Aaron Swartz, the late Aaron Swartz, who for many people is a beacon, but for me he's a beacon of courage in the work that he's done as an activist. But I was really pleased to find this piece of unfinished work that was published freely. And in here he was talking about the programmable web, and he says, well, perhaps peer-to-peer is where we're actually going to end up, because it gives us the best of both worlds. It gives us a chance to collaborate as well as modify locally. And it reminded me of, why don't we start sharing data sets using something like BitTorrent style? The beauty of this is that the publisher relinquishes all responsibility of getting the data out. If you want, it moves responsibility over to the people that actually want the data. And that's what BitTorrent does. If you want it, you'll find a way to get that torrent file, and then it doesn't matter where it's located, you will pull in all the bits and pieces, and you will reconstruct your data set or your file as you wish. So what we're talking about here for digital activists is that how to turn open data into knowledge is that the first thing we're interested in is lowering the cost of participation. That is by actually having frictionless data sets. And then we want to lower the cost of discovery, right, by having appropriate tooling for doing data composition and trend and analysis. And then lower the cost of sharing. And when we do that, then it becomes a mental cost mostly. But the world doesn't stop there, because we also need to collaborate with our friends on the social side, who are organizers of things. And so for the social activists, we need knowledge close at hand, ability to reach people, and ability to get feedback. Martin was talking about in the previous talk about what a difficult problem it is to acquire feedback from citizens. And that's not different. But just to remind you what activism is all about. So activism is a call for people to gather, to apply pressure for a cause. That's what it is. It doesn't matter what kind of pressure, or what kind of cause, whether it's social, political, environmental. It doesn't matter, you know. But most commonly, it's used to stop exploitation, to alleviate some kind of underdevelopment. There's a horrible word that's being used by the media and has become quite ubiquitous, and we say it's the developing countries. Actually, it's the underdeveloped countries. It's not developing. It's a euphemism. It's being glossed over. It's underdeveloped, right? And it comes from unfair agreements for things that we need to gain access to. So that's most commonly what kind of activism that I have been exposed to. But largely, it's about establishing new social contracts, establishing new relationships. And so activists are the facilitators, they're the shepherds for actually asking us to establish new relationships. And those new relationships are born when we have equal and fair agreements between different people. That's what it comes down to, is that we establish an agreement to say this is the way we will work and behave and collaborate and live life. That's what we're after. So this knowledge close at hand, an interesting thing is Federated Wikis by Ward Cunningham, and it just popped up when I was preparing and doing research for this, is that, wow, that is significantly different, because our understanding of a wiki is that multiple authors on the same document. But he's saying, hey, there's another way to do this. There's a single author for a single document, but if there's many of us that are single authors for our documents, with local storage, localized to my space, a federation of those creates this bigger wiki. And that's an interesting idea of maybe that is some way that we actually share these kinds of infographics and facts and knowledge. There's also about how do we reach people. And reaching people is not about shotgun marketing, and it's not about getting your message out on Twitter or Facebook or anything like that. This is about very, very specific marketing. And you speak to social activists, there's a lot of marketing theory and strategy goes into this. They even do A/B testing. We'll write the message out like this and send it out to that group, and we'll write a message worded like that and send it to that group, and we'll collect feedback and see which one is more appropriate. There will be times in the day that we'll send a message out. This is science. This is not in my days of activism where it was whispering and clandestine hoods and you meet up in the dark type of thing. You know, so, and the whole idea here is that it's to create awareness. And there's many times we want that communication to be private anyway. And how do you receive feedback? The trick with this feedback is that it's not always the feedback on the channel that you went out. So I could have sent out a bunch of SMSs, but in that SMS I will call for you to pledge your support for our effort by phoning this particular number and hanging up, a missed call, right? And the reason why activists would do something like that is that one person, if I send an SMS to Russell, Russell will tell Dan sitting on the end and say, hey, Dan, I saw this SMS, and Dan will actually phone, but he never got the SMS. But I want the feedback that there's one more person that's actually interested in what we're doing. So open data is not the end game at all. Not at all, not for me. So it's just a prerequisite so that we can actually carve out new social contracts and relationships. And as software developers, that is something that we can actually get involved in, because it is largely from a digital side about data science and about the tooling that we have that we can create for ourselves around data, so that we can make data science a little bit easier. And so, you know, just to summarize what we're talking about here, so my idea here and the vision that I'm trying to put forward, whether it materializes or not, is something that will speak for itself in years or months to come, is that frictionless data sets make it easier for us to compose new data sets at will, so that we can discover new facts, and that we can share these facts in an independent way so that social activists can distribute it. And when they distribute it widely, we take this knowledge and we make it common knowledge. So this brings me back to 1992. And would it have been valuable? Pre-1992, there was an international call for economic boycott of South Africa. At that point in time, we just trusted our leaders and said, yes, boycott. But it was us, the people on the ground, that actually had to make the sacrifice for economic boycotts. There was one day that we woke up, I'll trivialize it. You wake up one day and there's no more Pepsi. Okay. Kodak disappears. Okay. IBM supposedly disappeared, but they were there in the defense departments. So they are that kind of, so the sacrifice that, if we understood the sacrifice that we were making and the impact of an economic boycott on the white minority government at that point in time, perhaps we would have appreciated it better. But we didn't have the tooling and the access to data that we have today. So perhaps it wouldn't have made any difference. These days, we're fighting against corruption. In a fledgling democracy, we've gone from euphoria of dismantling apartheid and we're all great rainbow nation to complete corruption where few people are just exploiting the system. So we want to know how much is being siphoned off the top, right? We want to know what is the money trail, at what cost to our people, what could we have done with that? And those are interesting questions to be answered. And there's data out there that we might have to dig really deep, that's not open, but we can get access to them. Like I have a few people that I know at StatsSA. Shh, don't record that part. So there are ways to do that. They will let me out, hey, of Denmark. But there's some ideological questions that we need answering as well, which I don't want to talk about now, but it is important. So how soon will it be before open data is exploited for evil? That is something we should be cognizant of, because I guarantee you, all good things can be used for evil. What are the consequences if you consider data as a natural resource, like gold and oil? And I certainly hope we don't have to trade data, because that's what we're doing at the moment. But what are the agreements that are in place? Should we have to consider data as a natural resource so that we can actually alter social contracts? And then, in the Internet of Things, we heard this morning when we're being introduced, and someone said, by 2020, there's going to be 50 billion devices connected to the Internet. And so privacy is the next freedom, and we're not talking about that. The desire to switch off and say, please leave me alone, is going to become a big thing, I think. And that's what we're going to give up when we go towards this Internet of Things. And associated with that is, how do we get access to the data that we are providing? How do I get my data back? Which are the challenges that we're fighting about right now. And to wrap up, the reason why I'm wearing a T-shirt with a cow on it, it's a Nguni cow from South Africa. It's indigenous to South Africa. And it's a T-shirt from a concert that I went to by this guy, Johnny Clegg, a singer-songwriter from South Africa. One of my favorite singer-songwriters, very close to the same level as Bob Marley. But there's a song that he sings called Scatterlings of Africa, and he considers that his favorite song. And he says, magic machine cannot match human being. It's an African idea. And what is appealing to here is this African idea of Ubuntu, that is, people exist because of other people. I exist because you exist and you make me exist. And that trumps machinery. And so because of us that exist because of each other, and he appeals to the scatterlings of Africa. He's an anthropologist. He studied anthropology. He lectured anthropology. And so the scatterlings of Africa is going back to the cradle of mankind comes from Africa. And so you're all scatterlings of Africa. Every single one of you has been uprooted. And so we're all on the road to Pelamanga. Pelamanga is this imaginary world where lies don't exist. And that's where you find the ultimate truth. And there's many of us that are already on this road. So in your own little world, your own little community, you can actually make a difference. You really, really can make a difference. As a geek, you can go and make a difference by actually playing with data in your spare time and sharing that with people. And if you're on the other side of the organizing side, you can come join me and do this as well. So activism for me is about common knowledge, not just about raw data. Thank you. Okay, so the question is that I propose you pick data sources and then start exploring it, and there's a possibility that, or a very strong possibility that you actually don't even know what you're looking for. So you don't even know what data you're looking for, but you have a question that needs answering. So how do you go about doing that? So I had a question that needed answering about Kailicha. So I went hoovering around looking for data that actually supported that. That statement of declaring your ignorance to say that, hey, I actually don't know this, what can I use to do that, is a very common way. It's kind of very forensics style of thinking, is that here's a scene, and what can I discern from the scene, and it might be data that's tangential to that that you can use to infer certain things in the scene. So I don't think there's one way of solving that problem, one way of approaching it. So, yes?
So what about quality?
So how do we ensure quality of data? How do we know it's not manipulated at the source? I'll take that in two parts. How do you know it's not manipulated at the source? How do we ensure quality of data? You can't ensure quality of data, and no data is all 100% accurate. If the data is coming from a statistical organization at a national or research level, they have an obligation to present error margins as well. So you have an idea of that. You can also use different data sets around the same space, around the same concepts, to correlate where the quality of data and the error margins on that. How do you know the data has not been doctored and fiddled is a different problem. And I've deliberately left out this wild idea of using DRM for data sets. So I don't know how to solve that problem, but it is a reality. And I think that also feeds into the ideological question of when does it start being used for evil?
And that might be a problem. There was actually, I mean, the peer-to-peer looks like a good idea, but then
Yeah.
you never know.
Yeah, so there's lots of problems still to be solved, and I just want to put down some ideas of where I think we could be moving, which would be, I believe, still better than where we're at the moment. Anyone else? Okay, thank you.